2005, Japan. It's a rainy night in Sakai. A man leaves an apartment and walks down a busy street with its neon signs blinding him from left and right. He passes by nightclubs, seafood shops, greasy dive bars and saunas, not even reading most of the signs. The night changed its hues from red to green, yellow, pink and soft blue. Paddles reflect the colors and lines and distort the faces, halting their reflections. The man heads to the internet cafe, where he will look for his next victim in an online suicide club. His name is Hiroshi Maue. He is a true sadist of the most extreme kind, the psychosexual maniac. There's little information on the internet about this man, his psychopathology, sexual deviations, and the reported crimes which led to his eventual arrest and dismiss. It's almost as if these hard-to-find resources and material on the matter, which brought shame upon the entire Japanese nation, have been subjected to eternal oblivion. But even the facts that can be found are deeply unpleasant, repulsive, and horrifying. And so, my young detectives, let us once again peer into the abyss of this criminally diseased mind. Hiroshi Maue was born on August 8, 1968 in Sakai, Japan, the second largest city after Osaka in terms of area and population, located in the same prefecture. Hiroshi grew up with a brother and his father was a police officer. The boy's parents divorced and Hiroshi took the separation from his father hard, choosing to remain with his mother. When Maue attended kindergarten, the peculiar sides of his personality began to emerge. Since postal workers in Japan deliver parcels and letters by scooter, their uniform includes a white helmet. And the boy became obsessed with this item. Many children like fire trucks or uniforms, but little Hiroshi experienced a different kind of delight. He had a strange fixation to the postal worker's white helmet and accompanying uniforms to boot. And when the boy realized that other children did not share his admiration, the inkling of a notion began to grow within him that he was different from all the rest. When Hiroshi was in elementary school, he came across a detective novel. It described death by strangulation and had an illustration of a woman being grabbed and gagged by a nose and mouth. She seemed to be suffocating in that death grip. Hiroshi found it extremely erotic, and when he learned that his peers did not have the same reaction to the illustration and the topic of suffocation, he became fully convinced that he was not like the others. In 4th and 5th grade, Hiroshi eagerly watched detective stories, where the victim's mouth was covered with a chloroform-soaked rag. They passed out and got kidnapped. Another childhood memory related to asphyxia. He watched his father choke a criminal during an arrest. The boy admired his police officer father and longed for him after the breakup with his mother. Hiroshi later recalled, "My dad was on the side of justice and worked to catch bad guys." However, Maue's father also had problems with alcohol and was once arrested for drunk driving. After this incident, Hiroshi seemed to have become disillusioned. "My father is a criminal, not a defender of the law," he said later. When Hiroshi was in high school, he developed another fetish when he discovered that he became aroused by the white socks worn by the school gym teacher. After graduating from high school, he moved across town to begin his higher education at the Kanazawa Institute of Technology, located in the city of Nanoichi, Ishikawa Prefecture. After a short time there, Maue got into trouble. One day, he attacked one of his acquaintances and tried to strangle him for reasons unknown. The would-be victim fought back desperately, and Hiroshi failed. The disturbed young man suffered no disciplinary action. Perhaps he presented the incident as a joke or said that he had attacked in a state of madness from ridicule. And what is even more likely saved him was his father, who still served on the police force. This incident appears to have been Hiroshi's first attempt to bring his fantasies to life. Regardless, in 1988, he dropped out shortly after this incident. At some point in 1995, Hiroshi worked at the post office. After work one night at a bar with postal worker colleagues, Hiroshi confessed to a co-worker that he was a fan of disabled wrestling. In Japan, this sport has an element of professional wrestling that involves people with disabilities. Wrestlers with physical limitations, mutilations, or mental peculiarities enter the ring and fight in a gladiator-style battle with no rules. Just because a person was born with cerebral palsy doesn't mean they don't want or aren't capable of defeating someone in a sweaty clash for the sake of glory and the feeling of invincibility. This league welcomes anyone with any disability to the ring, but this condition can range from multiple sclerosis to depression, and the rules depend on the personal preferences and consent of the respective wrestlers. Hiroshi confessed to his colleague that every time he watches this show, he has multiple uncontrolled orgasms. Mayue was harassed by mentally disabled and the maimed and physically disabled, and he especially liked watching them get hurt. He even sent letters to his favorite fighters, but when they didn't respond, Hiroshi was filled with resentment and anger. He felt an irresistible desire to kill his idols. His coworker was shocked. Later he confessed, "I didn't find anything funny about someone I work with creaming his pants every time he sees disabled and mentally challenged people beating the crap out of each other. I decided I should report him to the police." The man would have surely been even more shocked to learn that his colleague Mayue had not chosen the postal worker job by chance, as he would often get aroused when seeing his colleagues in white helmets or white socks, and would experience sexual satisfaction just by them showing up to work and going about their daily tasks. This disturbed work colleague was contemplating how to notify the authorities about Mayue's disturbed desires. Hiroshi was arrested for the first time. He attacked another colleague and tried to strangle him in the bathroom, at first glance for no apparent reason. But this time Hiroshi's father had resigned from the police but was again ready to help his son avoid punishment. The man avoided imprisonment for the second time. The case never made it to court because Mayue's father was able to establish an out-of-court settlement with the victim and his family. This did not send Hiroshi to jail, but it did get him discharged and denied his place in the postal service career. After the failed escapade in the workplace bathroom and tormented by the desire to satisfy his sexual appetite, Hiroshi began to roam the streets at night in search of his lone victims. In 2001, his father's patronage could no longer help him. Mayue was arrested. He attacked 2 women twice and tried to strangle them with a chemical-soaked rag. For these cases, Hiroshi was found guilty and sentenced to 1 year in prison plus 3 years of probation. After his release a year later, Mayue picked up where he left off. He approached a high school student on the street and tried to strangle him. Hiroshi failed again and this time was sentenced to 10 months in prison. After his release, he switched jobs one after another. In 2004, Mayue worked as a temp employee at a camera manufacturing plant, and for a while he even managed to get a job as a taxi driver. Aside from his violent desires, Hiroshi had no focus or viable career path. By that time, he was 36 years old. He couldn't maintain any job for long and failed to build any lasting relationships in his life. After his 10-month imprisonment, Hiroshi was required to check in with his probation officer complicating matters and criminal access. since attacks on random street victims were unsuccessful, and he now had to observe a nightly 9 p.m. curfew, Hiroshi began to design his modus operandi. He created a personal website where he posted his own meticulously written fictional tale of proposed murder and violent sexual acts. The work contained themes close to Hiroshi's demented imagination: strangulation, asphyxia, and hanging. The 50-page document contained detailed descriptions and explanations of how to use these methods in killing someone. Through multiple edits and revisions of his work would have been proof enough to understand how many times Hiroshi had mentally rehearsed and refined what would later become his signature in soon-to-be very real murders. At night, Sakai is lit by countless city lights, slot machines, burning cigarettes, clocks, trains, street lamps, and fast food signs. Some small apartments are illuminated only by computer screens, and their inhabitants use the internet not for shopping, not for listening to music or watching videos, but to discuss and sometimes plan out the best way to part with life itself. This is the other side of the internet, the dark web where suicide forums and communities gather for those contemplating taking their own lives or depicting vicious murder wish lists or even requests for hitmen. In medieval Japan, suicide was considered an almost honorable act. Noble samurai committed harakiri or seppuku to atone for their guilt or try to wash away their dishonor with blood. But in modern Japan, suicide has turned into a distaste of endless fatigue rather than to noble act. Japan ranks 7th in suicide rate among the advanced countries with a booming population count. In recent years, Tokyo has done tremendous work to bring down the number of people attempting suicide. But while these measures gave some results with helping adults going through crises, things have become much more complicated with teenagers. Many of them turn to the internet in search of the best way to commit suicide and possibly find a partner to live life together with. It was on one such online suicide forum that the maniac went hunting for his victims. Hiroshi Maewa began visiting websites and communities, posing as a lonely soul determined to settle scores with life. To do this, he spent sometimes up to 22 hours a day in a quiet internet cafes. This is not too much considering that some Japanese people have even lived in such cyber establishments. In addition to chatting with suicidal youths, Hiroshi viewed severely violent BDSM materials, amputees, and grotesque torture tapes, strangulation, and all manifestations of sexual deviations. Pretty much anything and in between that might help to satisfy his growing and unhealthy interests. For several months, Hiroshi had been chatting in an online suicide club with 25-year-old office worker Michiko Nagamoto. The girl was depressed due to unsuccessful romantic relationships and contemplating suicide. Maewa realized that his age and looks would repel the attractive young woman. So when she asked to chat via video link, he lied that his webcam was broken. Instead, Hiroshi sent Michiko an alleged recent photo of himself, not his own, of course, but that of some handsome young man. During their conversations, they made a suicide pact and began preparing for the day when they would carry it out. The plan was to light charcoal for a picnic inside a locked car and poison themselves with carbon monoxide, which according to Hiroshi was the most painless way to die. He did not come up with this method himself. In 2005 at least, 65 people died as a result of such arrangements. The man also convinced the girl to leave behind a definitive suicide note to her family and to delete the correspondence between them before their meeting. Although Michiko did write a note, she either forgot or deliberately decided not to delete the collection emails and messages. On February 19, 2005, Hiroshi rented a car and drove from Sakai to Inaka, the quiet area where Michiko lived with her parents. They agreed to meet on a deserted street nearby. Seeing what her online pen pal looked like in real life, Michiko was horrified. Then Mayoa played dumb and convinced the girl that he was just the father of the young man and had come to give her a ride. Hiroshi took Nagamoto to a secluded spot by the river in the Katsuragi mountain area, Osaka Prefecture. He grabbed Michiko and pressed a chemical-soaked rag to her face. When the girl lost consciousness, Hiroshi put on gloves, tied the victim's hands behind the car seat, and tied her legs. When Michiko regained awareness and began to struggle to free herself, all the time begging Hiroshi to let her go and calling him a murderer. But he took a standard kitchen plastic wrap and proceeded to gag the girl's mouth and nose, ultimately restricting her access to breathing fresh air. Death from oxygen starvation can occur within just a few seconds, causing cardiac arrest. But even if the heart is not beating, the brain can continue to live oxygen-free for 10 minutes. And all this time, gradual neurological degradation will be taking place. Clearly, this was far from the easy way out that the girl had hoped for. What if, in the process of dying, the killer tries to revive the victim only to repeat it all over again? This is exactly what Hiroshi did. When Michiko lost consciousness, the man would remove the polyethylene film, letting her senses come back to her, and then repeated this process several times, staring intently at his victim's face. Michiko tried to resist, but at some point she gave up. She stopped wasting the last moments of her life on useless pleas to the killer, and instead whispered a prayer with her remaining faculties. At some point, her body shuddered involuntarily, and the girl died. All this time, Hiroshi was filming this sick process on video. He later dumped the body off a steep cliff by the river to make the police think Michiko Nagamoto had jumped. Afterwards, Mayu went home to review the footage over and over again, hoping to relieve the exhilaration of the excruciatingly long moment of murder. He continued to frequent an internet cafe to look for new victims on the suicide site. Michiko Nagamoto's body was found on February 23, 2005, 4 days after her death, and later the police were able to establish her identity by her fingerprints. At first, detectives declared it an obvious suicide, but the autopsy would later show signs of a violent death. An investigation was launched, and despite Hiroshi's belief that the suicide note would help conceal the murder, he quickly became a suspect. Investigators managed to find email correspondence between the two, including plans to rent a vehicle and commit to their joint suicide pact. Hiroshi's prior legal troubles raised suspicions among the police, and the detectives put two and two together and arrested the 38-year-old Hiroshi at his home in Sakai without resistance. He was taken to the police station in August 2005. When the authorities confronted Hiroshi with evidence of his guilt, he was willing to talk and cooperate. He confessed to strangling Michiko Nagamoto, then shocked detectives by confessing to 2 more murders. Hiroshi said that in addition to the girl, he had strangled a 14-year-old middle school student and a 21-year-old college student. As with Michiko, Hiroshi noticed them after they posted on the suicide site. He was in no hurry and got to know his victims better before convincing them to make a mutual suicide pact with him. However, the perverted killer never intended to kill himself. He needed an object to satisfy his deviant sexual needs. Hiroshi admitted dumping the bodies in mountainous areas of the Osaka prefecture. The police were skeptical of Mayo's claims at first, but decided to follow up on the 2 other victims. After reviewing identified corpse reports, detectives found matches to Hiroshi Mayo's confession. It is not uncommon in Japan for the media to conceal the identities of victims to preserve their family's privacy and honor. And although photos of Mayo's murderer people are not widely available, we do know their names. The 14-year-old victim was a boy named Shiotani Maira. Hiroshi specifically targeted this teenager because he had already run away from home once before, and at the time of his disappearance, he had been upset over a female classmate he was hopelessly in love with. So, when Shiotani disappeared again, his parents did not panic at first. They figured he would be back soon. The police found out that before leaving home, the teenager had sent a message to one of his friends saying that he was going to meet a girl he met on a suicide site. When Maira later went missing, his friend assumed that he had killed himself as planned. A few days after Shiotani's disappearance, his family received a strange ransom letter. They called the police, but there were no leads and the case remained unresolved. The friend and family of the teenager did not know that the girl Shiotani had agreed to take his life, which was hundreds of times less nice and thousands of times more dangerous than they had imagined. Instead of a girl, the 14-year-old boy was chatting with the 36-year-old unemployed Hiroshi Maue, looking for a player to his supposed victimless crime. After Hiroshi's confession, police conducted a search in a deserted, wooded area where, according to him, he dumped the teenager's body off a rocky cliff, and there they found the severely decomposed remains. 21-year-old college student Haruko Ida was depressed because of problems with his studies. He had recently been getting poor grades and was afraid of getting kicked out of university, as this would bring shame on his family. His shame and debts continued to grow with seemingly no way out. With Haruko, the killer did not pretend to be someone else. These two got along. They shared a common passion for disabled wrestling and the Beatles. Maue assured Haruko that in certain Beatles songs, the musicians encoded a hidden message to their fans to commit suicide. And intoxicated by this grotesque mixture of power wrestling and the Beatles, Ida agreed to meet Hiroshi and end their lives together. They were going to drive far away in a rented car, light charcoal and die from carbon monoxide poisoning. When the police found Ida's body hanging from a tree, they of course assumed that it was a suicide. After all, he had been chatting in suicide forums, and most importantly, there was a suicide note in his pocket. It was next to a badge of his favorite wrestler, but it wasn't a suicide. Hiroshi later recounted that they had been driving for almost an hour when Ida stopped the car because he needed the bathroom. They got out and walked a bit into the woods when Mayowe picked up a rock and knocked the student senseless. He wrapped a rope around the unconscious body's neck, threw one end over a tree, and turned on his camera. When Ida came to, Mayowe started pulling on the rope, strangling the young man, and experiencing incredible sexual arousal. The victim cried and begged for mercy. Hiroshi repeated his ritual over and over, alternately strangling then reviving the victim, until finally the hapless Haruko died. Pressure on the trachea cuts off direct blood flow to the brain. It can also cause blood pressure fluctuations in the carotid artery. According to the police officers who found the body, Ida's eyes had nearly popped out of their sockets due to intracranial pressure. After murdering the young college student and his supposed friend and confidant, Hiroshi returned to his business, namely looking for his next online victim. That's how he lured Michiko Nagamoto into a meeting. When Hiroshi Mayowe was asked by authorities why he committed these murders, he had a simple explanation. He told the police that he experiences sexual arousal whenever he sees a person suffocate. Their expression of agony was the reason he couldn't take his eyes off his victims' faces as they died at his hands. Hiroshi recounted that in order to prolong the pleasure, he would strangle the victims, stop when they lose consciousness, wait for them to regain their senses in fear, only for him to repeat it all over again. He used the suicide website to find his victims because it was a place where they could most easily to be found. The first two men were killed a month apart, about 4 months before he killed Michiko Nagamoto. After obtaining a warrant to search Maiwa's home and a storage facility across the street from his house, officers went looking for evidence. At Hiroshi's apartment, the police discovered a large number of pornographic videos on the theme of strangulation. But the storage room, which Hiroshi called his movie theater, contained the most gruesome evidence. There, on the computer, the police discovered a file folder called Execution Chronicle. This folder contained photos of the 14-year-old schoolboy victim, a video recording of his murder, as well as a video recording of the 21-year-old college student's hanging. This is also where the recording of 25-year-old Michiko Nagamoto's final moments were also stored. But the police seized many more videos in which Hiroshi strangled other people, a total of 10 victims. Is it possible that Maiwa's victims were far more numerous than what he confessed to? Detectives were unable to identify the other people in the videos. To this day, it remains unknown whether Maiwa actually killed the people he recorded strangling or if they are still alive. Given this person's psychosexual problems, it is easy to assume that the murders he committed at age 36 could have been far from the first. Hiroshi Maiwa underwent a psychiatric evaluation. He assured the psychiatrist that he was a virgin and did not even masturbate at the crime scenes despite his extreme sexual arousal at those moments. He admitted that he could not achieve sexual release without strangulation, but claimed that he never had any sexual contact with the victims, that sexual assault had never been the motive for his attacks. Nudity did not arouse him. Gender and age also did not matter. The only thing the sadist wanted was to see his victims suffering. Hiroshi also recounted that he had once intended to get married, but his fiancée broke off the engagement because he was not interested in intimate contact with her. It seems more likely that the girl did not share in his sexual preferences. But in any case, according to Maiwa, after that he never tried to enter into any other intimate relationships. The mental health expert who evaluated the defendant testified in court, stating that he had diagnosed Hiroshi with a paraphilic psychosexual disorder, an emotional disorder characterized by intense sexual urges, fantasies and behaviors associated with atypical objects, situations or people. In Hiroshi's case, these fantasies were focused on strangulation and therefore the disorder could potentially cause harm to himself or others. The expert added that despite his disorder, Hiroshi was fully aware of his actions. Hiroshi Maiwa pleaded guilty to only 3 murders. There were certainly many more victims, but the authorities had enough evidence regarding known cases. When the judge asked the defendant if he would commit similar crimes if released from prison, he replied, "I have concerns that yes, I might." Prosecutors demanded the death penalty, insisting that Maiwa poses a threat as he cannot control his sexual urges caused by the sight of a person suffocating and suffering, also given his repeated arrests for similar crimes. On March 28, 2007, the Osaka District Court sentenced Hiroshi Maiwa to death. This method of punishment continues to garner overwhelming public support in Japan, which has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. Handing down the sentence, Judge Kozo Mizushima said of the defendant, "He's cruel, heartless, devilish, and his sexual tendencies are so deeply ingrained that they would be difficult to correct." Hiroshi appealed the court's decision, but in July 5, 2007, withdrew his appeal. Instead of fighting for his life, he insisted that he wants to pay for his crimes with death, and the poetic method of taking his life should be strangulation. On July 28, 2009, 40-year-old Hiroshi Mayoe was hanging along with 25-year-old Yuiko Yamazaki and another Chinese citizen who killed 6 people. There are shocking rumors that Mayoe was the only death row inmate in Japan allowed to masturbate at the moment when the executioner put the noose around his neck. But there is no evidence to support that this was more than just an urban legend designed to fit this serial killer's wanton proclivities. People interested in Japan are often not surprised by the peculiar combination in its culture of closeted yet provocative perversity around pornography and strict norms of social conformity. Its socialized world seems divided into a contemplative, spiritual, and outright obscene and ambiguously weird side that causes anxiety in onlookers from other cultures' ways of life. Japan is a world in and of itself, with universally recognized perfectionists and lovers of beauty in both form and function. There will occasionally be born and raised those individuals who choose not to display such phenomenally sick and ugly paraphilic disorders that it's too much even for the Japanese people to take notice before it's too late. Mayoe's personal website, dedicated to asphyxia, was shut down sometime after his arrest in 2005, and now his book is unavailable to general public. The respectable citizens of the land of the rising sun were apparently so happy to erase every mention of this killer from their lives after Mayoe's execution, to wipe out any memory or trace of him, that one can barely find a single photo of this man online. One photo remains plastered in the internet. In it, Hiroshi stands in prison garb while biting in his lower lip like some kind of bashful schoolboy. While others would become copycat killers in his wake, Hiroshi Mayoe's entire life was reduced to a name in crime chronicles, and the rest swept under the rug out of shame. His punishment by death became an example as the result to unhinged and dangerous psychosexual serial killer, only surviving as painful scars in the hearts and minds of his victims, families, and the utter shock of a nation's pride and people.